What's up, investors? It's the Russian dude. Over the last 48 hours, the Russia-Ukraine war has produced many newsworthy events that we will talk about in today's briefing. First of all, in Moscow, something that used to feel distant from ordinary Russian life is becoming harder to ignore, because mobile internet shutdowns have been disrupting the routine of millions of residents, affecting cafes, shops, taxis, ATMs, parking meters, and even access to foreign websites in central Moscow, in the capital of Russia, previously thought unreachable. At the same time, another report suggests that this may not be only about temporary security measures linked to Ukrainian drone pressure, but part of a broader move toward internet isolation that could eventually complicate Russia's own military communications, especially through Telegram, which has become a key tool for Russian soldiers, military bloggers, and even volunteer networks. And while that is happening in the Russian capital, Moscow is also trying to project strength on the battlefield, with Valery Gerasimov claiming that Russian forces took 12 settlements in the first 2 weeks of March alone, and are on the defensive across all the front lines. Beyond that, Kyiv is trying to turn its drone experience into a new source of money and technology by helping Gulf states defend against Iranian Shahed drones, while Europe is showing more visible cracks, with Belgian Prime Minister Bart Wever openly talking about the need for a deal with Russia. We then also have Hungary's Peter Szijjarto saying that Budapest will keep blocking a 90 billion euro loan for Ukraine and new sanctions until oil flows through Druzhba pipeline resumes. And then finally, behind all of this, the Russian central bank may cut its benchmark rate from 15.5 to 15% on March 20th, with all 23 analysts on Reuters poll expecting a 50 basis point cut, which tells you that the economic layer of this war is still shifting under the surface. So the thesis for today's briefing is very simple. The most interesting thing happening right now is not just whether Russia is claiming local gains. The deeper pattern is that this war is increasingly colliding with systems that were supposed to keep the Russian state itself stable and the broader international environment that manageable. Communications, sanctions, energy, and the central bank policy are all starting to blur together. And when this happens, the battlefield stops being just the front line. It starts spreading into capitals, financial planning, coalition politics, and the daily lives of ordinary people. This is what makes this news cycle so worth taking seriously. And the first place to start is going to be the capital of Russia, Moscow, where the story begins with something as ordinary as just trying to use your phone and realizing that the state may be preparing society for a much less connected future. Now here's where things get interesting. For years, the Kremlin tried to keep the hardest effects of this war at a distance from ordinary life in Moscow. I mean, yes, there were sanctions, censorship, and rising prices, but daily life in the capital still projected the image of a city that could keep functioning normally. What AP media describes now is just way different. Many foreign websites were blocked on mobile phones in central Moscow, under restrictions that had already gripped the city far more for than just one single week, disrupting the routine of millions and hitting businesses that depend on this cell phone internet. This is not just an abstract policy debate. This is cafes, restaurants, shops, ATMs, parking meters, taxi apps, and even just ordinary people calling just to their families. All of this is being affected. According to Kommersant, cited by IAP, Moscow businesses lost between 3 and 5 billion rubles, roughly $38 to $63 million, in just 5 days of these shutdowns. That is the kind of number that turns a security measure into a visible economic pain. And what makes this story more important than just a simple outage report is the political meaning behind it. Russian authorities say that these restrictions are needed to counter Ukrainian drone attacks, which on the surface kinda makes sense, sounds reasonable enough, as long as you're in the wartime, which Russia is now. But many industry experts suspect something broader is happening right now, which is preparation for the possibility of cutting Russians off from the global web entirely, if the Kremlin decides that the moment has finally come. Russia has already blocked major social media sites such as Twitter, X, Facebook and Instagram, Meta and Instagram, after the February 2022 invasion. And later even restricted apps like WhatsApp and Telegram while promoting the state-backed messenger Max, which critics and we all guys see as just a surveillance tool by the FSB. So when foreign websites begin disappearing in central Moscow, people are not just seeing a technical problem. They are seeing another layer of state control that is becoming increasingly normalized in real time. That matters because it changes how we should think about domestic stability inside Russia. If the capital begins to experience disruptions that once felt limited, temporarily, or absent completely, then the war is no longer just something the Kremlin manages through distance and propaganda. It becomes something that interferes with convenience, payment systems, transportation, and just the illusion that Moscow is insulated and just in general, ordinary people's lives. And if you think that this is interesting, wait until you hear why the internet angle could become even more dangerous for Russia's own war machine. But that's only half the story. The NDTV piece adds a second layer, because it argues that deeper internet isolation could end up hurting not only Russian civilians, but Russia's own military effort. The key issue here is Telegram. NDTV says that Telegram has become a key communication tool for Russian soldiers, military bloggers and volunteer networks supporting the war effort, with troops relying on it to coordinate operations outside traditional command structures. One Russian soldier who heads a drone repair and supply workshop told Politico, this is his quote, "All military work goes through Telegram, all communication." And then warned that shutting it down would be, another quote, like self-sabotaging the entire Russian army. He said much more 18+ word, but you get it. That quote is dramatic, but it highlights something real. When a modern military grows dependent on flexible digital ecosystems, those systems become vulnerabilities too. NDTV also notes that Russia's communications regulator began slowing access to Telegram nationwide in early February. And then Russian media reports say that authorities are considering shutting the platform down in April entirely, even if some restrictions may not apply to the front lines right away. So just now imagine the contradiction. The state wants tighter informational control, fewer channels for dissent, and more pressure pushing users towards MAX, while Russia's military ecosystem has adapted to a messy, semi-decentralized digital environment where Telegram matters because it is fast, familiar, and widely used. There is another detail here that makes this even more important. NDTV reports that Russian units were already facing communication challenges after SpaceX tightened authentication rules for Starlink terminals in early February, which blocked many terminals used by Russian forces through unauthorized connections. According to Kenting, that led to approximately 75% drop in Starlink traffic inside Ukraine. Before those restrictions, satellite-linked internet reportedly allowed drone operators to stream live video from the battlefield to commanders for way faster decision-making and real-time coordination. So now just place those two things together. Outside access gets tighter because Starlink authentication changes, and internal communication could become less flexible if Telegram faces even now harsher restrictions. Just that combination would not automatically cripple Russian operations, at least not now, but it would most certainly could make a military that already depends on adaptation and unofficial workarounds less agile than before. That gets us to the way bigger point. States at war often centralize control because they just fear disorder. But the longer a war lasts, the more they begin depending on improvised supply lines, workarounds, parallel communication channels, and people solving problems outside perfect bureaucratic systems. Russia is no exception, however Putin wishes it to be. So if Moscow is trying to build a more closed digital space while still relying on wartime improvisation, it may be setting up a trade-off between political control and military flexibility. And just when the Kremlin wants to project confidence on the battlefield, this is where the story shifts to what Moscow is saying about actual territorial progress. Here is where most people go wrong. They see a headline saying Russia has taken 12 settlements in the first 2 weeks of March, and jump to one of the two lazy conclusions. Either they say that this proves Russia is surging everywhere, or they dismiss it entirely as propaganda and just move on. Either this or that. But the more useful approach is to ask what the claim actually tells us, even if we treat it cautiously. Reuters reports that Russian state-run agencies cited Valery Gerasimov, chief of Russia's general staff, saying on March 16th that Russian forces had taken control of 12 settlements in the first 2 weeks of March and were on the offensive across all the other front lines. The claim came during his visit to the southern grouping of forces. Even if you do not accept every Russian battlefield claim at face value, the messaging at least still matters. Gerasimov is not just offering a map update, he is shaping expectations. By saying Russia is on the offensive across all the front lines, he is trying to reinforce an image of sustained pressure and initiative at a moment when other parts of the Russian story look much more complicated. Things like that Europe is divided, Moscow's internet environment is under stress, and the Russian economy is still requiring careful management from the central bank. But here is another angle. Zelenskyy in the Reuters piece about Middle East drone help said that Ukraine's military believed the planned Russian spring offensive had already failed, because Moscow had intended for it to be fully underway already, and it's not. That does not mean that Russia is not advancing locally, it just means that the real argument now is not whether Russia can move at all, but whether these gains amount to the decisive acceleration Moscow hoped for. Tactical gains and strategic momentum are not the same thing. A state can take villages, improve positions, and still fail to generate the kind of breakthrough that changes the wider course of war. So, what does this really mean? It means that the battlefield chapter has to be read alongside everything else. If Russia were truly converting battlefield pressure into overwhelming strategic leverage, you might expect European divisions to be even sharper and economic management to look more relaxed. Instead, what we see is a more complicated picture. A government still trying to control the information space in its own capital, coalition cracks that are real but incomplete, and a central bank still navigating inflation risks. We'll talk about all this in the future chapters. That does not look like effortless dominance. It looks like a grinding war where Moscow can still apply pressure, but where the wider system remains under pressure. And that pressure becomes even clearer once we move from the front line to the technological and financial dimension of the war. And before we forget, if you want to see some frontline footage, photos and videos, please go ahead and check them on my Patreon. That is the only place where I can upload those things freely without restrictions. The link is down below. Thanks so much for your memberships. Now let's continue. Here is the part that personally shocked me the most. Ukraine is no longer just fighting a drone-heavy war. It is trying to monetize what it has learned from that war. Reuters reports that Kyiv wants money and technology in return for helping Middle Eastern countries defend against Iranian kamikaze drone Shaheds. Zelenskyy said 3 Ukrainian teams were sent to the region to conduct expert assessments and demonstrate how drone defenses should operate, with teams going to Qatar, United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and then US military bases in Jordan. He made it very clear that this was not about Ukraine taking part in Gulf combat operations. His quote, almost exact quote, "We're not at war with Iran," he said. But he also then made the real objective equally clear. For us today, Zelenskyy said, both the technology and the funding are important. That is a remarkable shift, because it means Ukraine is trying to turn wartime competence into geopolitical capital. Gulf states have also spent large quantities of air defense missiles countering Iran Shahed drones, while Ukraine has spent night after night building a more layered response using cheaper, smaller drones and then jamming equipment alongside other systems entirely. According to Reuters, countries from Europe, the Middle East, the African continent, all of them have sought Ukrainian advice on how to counter these attacks. So Ukraine is just trying to position itself not only as a recipient of support, but as also supplier of operational knowledge in one of the most important security challenges of the moment. And then there is a number that really stands out. Zelenskyy said he wanted to sign a deal worth about $35 to $50 billion, though he did not know why Washington had not signed a major drone deal Kyiv had pushed earlier for months, and then was unsure whether it would even be agreed at all. That number matters because it shows the scale of ambition here. This is not some just kind of side project. This is Kyiv looking for a strategic financial technological partnership at a time when uncertainty is growing around the US attention and broader international priorities. And that brings us straight to Europe, because while Ukraine is trying to turn expertise into leverage, parts of Europe, at least 2-3 countries, are becoming much more open about how difficult it is to maintain a single agreed narrative against Russia. Let's focus here because there is something deeper going on. Euronews reports that Belgian Prime Minister Bart de Wever said that Europe must negotiate with Russia to end the war in Ukraine and restore access to cheap energy. He argued that Europe should support Ukraine militarily and rearm its eastern border, but also normalize relations with Russia and regain cheap energy, saying that it was just a common sense according to him. According to Euronews now, he framed the issue around Europe's inability to pressure Vladimir Putin effectively without US backing, arguing that if Europe cannot send enough weapons to Ukraine and cannot suffocate Russia's economy without the United States, then only single one method remains: just making a deal. This does not mean Europe is about to collectively pivot towards normalization. Euronews also knows that the European Union remains divided, with Poland and the Baltic states firmly opposed, while figures such as Emmanuel Macron, Giorgia Meloni, and Viktor Orban are described as open to direct talks with Moscow in different ways, quote-unquote. But the point is not whether the Wever alone defines European policy. The point is that these arguments are becoming more public and more direct. Because once a sitting prime minister openly says Europe must eventually normalize relations with Russia and recover cheaper energy, the debate is no longer just buried behind closed doors. It is there, it is happening. And this matters because the pressure for a deal with Russia may increasingly come not from people saying Moscow is right, but from people saying Europe is constrained. That is a much more politically potent line, because it sounds practical rather than ideological. And if you think that this is only rhetoric, the next chapter shows what coalition friction really looks like when it becomes operational. Because Hungary is not just talking about limits, Hungary is using them. Now here's the potential game changer. Reuters reports that Hungary will continue blocking a 90 billion euro, or about $103 billion loan for Ukraine and new sanctions on Russia as long as oil flows via the Druzhba pipeline remain suspended. Hungarian Foreign Minister Peter Szijjarto said this in Brussels on March 16th. Reuters adds that Russian oil flows through Druzhba to Hungary and Slovakia have been suspended already since late January. Kyiv then says that Russian strikes hit Druzhba pipeline equipment in western Ukraine, while Hungary and Slovakia blame Ukraine for the prolonged outage. That is a revealing standoff because it shows how infrastructure, blame narratives, and coalition politics are collapsing into one pressure point. One pipeline outage, regardless of who is ultimately responsible, now becomes a lever that can delay both major financial support for Ukraine and then fresh sanctions against Russia. That is exactly the kind of situation Moscow benefits from, even if the original disruption did not happen for political reasons. Because the Kremlin does not need every single European member to actively support Russia. It only needs just a few of them, just enough friction inside the coalition to slow decisions, destroy unity, and make every next package harder than the last. There is also a timing issue here. Europe is already dealing with tensions over energy after the Middle East war pushed global prices higher. The Euronews notes criticism from European leaders of Donald Trump's decision to lift sanctions on Russian oil because of market pressure. So Hungary's position on Druzhba pipeline is landing in an environment where energy vulnerability is again moving closer to the center of European decision-making. Once energy gets expensive or uncertain, strategic principles always face a very much harder political test. And that leads us directly into the final layer of this briefing. Because while Europe argues over oil, loans and sanctions, Russia's own economic managers are adjusting to a reality where higher oil prices could temporarily ease pressure even as inflation risks remain alive. Let's talk about it right now. Before we finish, here is one last thing to consider. Reuters reports that all 23 analysts in its poll expect that the Russian central bank to cut its benchmark interest rates by 50 basis points to 15% at the March 20th meeting. Current rate is at 15.5%, and Reuters says that the bank has been cutting since last June, though it still remains above 12% level that businesses think would allow growth to accelerate and resume. The reason this matters is not just the number itself, it is the contradiction behind it. On one hand, global oil prices have surged 40% since the attacks connected to the Iran war began, rising to the highest since 2022. And the US has also lifted sanctions on some Russian oil, making Russia one of the biggest beneficiaries of that conflict according to Reuters. On the other hand, Analysts are still warning about pro-inflationary risks, and policymakers had only recently drafted severe measures because oil prices had earlier fallen below $45 per barrel. This is why this chapter matters. Russia's war economy is not collapsing, but it is not also comfortably stable. It is highly sensitive to external price shift, sanctions enforcements, and fiscal assumptions. So, what does this all mean going forward? It means Russia may be entering the next stage of this war with a mixed hand. On the positive side for Moscow, battlefield pressure continues, Europe is visibly divided, higher oil prices offer temporary relief, and the central bank may feel confident enough to trim rates again. On the negative side, Moscow is dealing with domestic communication restrictions that increasingly affect civilian life. There is a risk of over-centralizing the digital space in ways that could reduce flexibility, and the economy still requires careful balancing between growth, inflation, and budget discipline. For Ukraine, the picture is also mixed. Battlefield pressure remains serious, and outside support is never something Kyiv can treat as automatic. But Ukraine is trying to do something smart in response by turning drone experience into international leverage rather than just waiting passively for help and doing nothing. So guys, if you want to understand where this war is heading next, you have to watch not only the front line, but also the infrastructure, the coalition politics, the communication networks, and the central bank signals around it. For this reason, if you haven't already, please subscribe for more daily briefings like this, and I will keep breaking it all down in order that makes the bigger picture easier to understand. Don't forget about the Patreon, link is down below. Thanks so much for watching, see you tomorrow.
Their twisted words and feeble claims on us all they cannot quell. We see through their lies, their feeble attempts to sway. We do not believe